There I was came saying.
Animation parents. Just parents in animation in general. If I wanted to list each trope individually, it would take up half of this list. Actually, it would take up more spaces than exist. Fun story, I wanted to make a list of the top 10 parents in animation, but I couldn't, because enough good parents in animation didn't exist. I don't know what it is, but it seems like the medium is specifically drawn to making the worst excuses for human beings possible as parents. My hatred of Buck Cluck was pretty much the established tone of my Chicken Little review. I don't know what it is, but it seems like the movie tried to showcase his sadistic, neglectful treatment of his son as charming.
You gotta be ready to listen to your children, even if they have nothing to say.
Animation is a medium that lends itself to extremes, as making something extreme and over the top tends to make it easier to mock and make fun of. But when the comedy ends up failing miserably, you get characters like Mr. and Mrs. Turner in the later seasons, who gleefully throw their hatred of having a son in Timmy's face. You know, when they aren't neglectful and oblivious to his existence. They're almost constantly tormenting him. It happens a lot in shows that have gone on way too long. By the end of the Rugrats, you spend episodes wondering how the babies haven't ended up dead because of how oblivious to the world their parents are. Sometimes it's necessary for the plot, like in Dexter's lab. If the parents were competent, we wouldn't have Dexter being able to hide his secret lab. The problem is that, number one, it's way overdone, to the point where it's hard to find exceptions, and two, that many shows push it way too far. I talked a lot about the dumbass dad trope, and it's especially painful in animation, mainly because it's so ubiquitous. I swear, it's like a standard writing rule. You capitalize the first letter in every sentence, and you gotta make sure you make your fathers act like idiots. It's just how it's done. I get that the common response to this is that many of these shows are aimed at kids, and many of these shows want to make kids feel good, and they do that by portraying their parents as less competent than them. And that makes sense to an extent, but then you realize not only does the same problem exist in adult animation, but it's even worse in adult animation. Insofar as, I don't think I can name a single good parent in all of adult animation. The Simpsons, Marge is a nag and Homer is a dumbass. The couple from Committed, nag and dumbass. Glenn Martin, nag and dumbass. Family Guy, worse than a dumbass and worse than a nag. Beth and Jerry from Rick and Morty. Oh my god, if you hate each other that fucking much, why don't you just get a divorce?
Jerry's going to spend some time divorced.
Oh wait, they got a divorce, that's a relief. Oh my fucking god, how are you two even worse separate? Also, Brian Griffin is a parent in 3 episodes of Family Guy, and that makes me debate our validity as a species. Even if it's not particularly bad, this stock template is in pretty much any cartoon that I can think of. Danny Phantom, Jimmy Neutron, Rugrats, Fairly Odd Parents, The Replacements. And if it's not a parent, it's the prominent authority figure in the kid's life. I like many of these shows, but it's always something that I end up respecting a show less for. How can you be this creative if you end up using something so beaten into the dust? For movies, what do you get? Ignoring Buck Cluck, we've got Jasmine's father, who is a dumbass. We've got Judy Hopps' parents, who are closed-minded awful. Remy's father from Ratatouille, who is closed-minded. Jack Black's shark father, who is closed-minded. The Book of Life is a story about a father who is too close-minded to accept his son's lifestyle. How to Train Your Dragon is a story about a father who is too close-minded to accept his son's lifestyle. The Little Mermaid is a story about a father who is too close-minded to accept his daughter's lifestyle. Got a big twist on that one. Remember, the movie Ivan the Incredible is about a father who is too close-minded to accept his son's lifestyle, and you don't want to be anything like Ivan the Incredible. While many of the movies that I have mentioned are fantastic, like Ratatouille or How to Train Your Dragon, I'm not going to be kind to any movies using the same fucking template over and over again. It's done. Sure, let's pretend that all fathers everywhere are closed-minded to their kids' unusual choices. It's not interesting anymore. You can't interest me in a new story about this concept. This even annoys me in some of my favorite animated movies of all time. Inside Out, for example. The one joke in the movie that everyone hates boils down to the mother is a nag and the father's a sports-obsessed moron ignorant to his kids and his family. And this is ignoring the times that one or more of the parents is dead. Here's a trivia question. How many main series Disney films exist where both of the parents are alive until the end of the movie? Vote on your smartphones now! Out of the currently 56 animated canon films, less than a dozen of them have the parents living all the way through. Tangled was the first time that it had happened since Hercules, which came out a decade prior. Before that it was Milan in 1998, and before that it was 101 Dalmatians. A span of more than 30 years. And the only times it really affected the plot was in The Lion King and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And that's what bugs me the most. When parents are dead in animated movies, it just always seems so arbitrary, like a random decision because the designers just didn't want to spend extra effort animating another parent. This death doesn't affect the main character at all. Maybe it'll come up about how the living parent isn't like the dead one at one tiny part, but that's about it. Sometimes you do get a story delving into the trauma and the emotions that this causes, like with Lilo and Stitch or Meet the Robinsons. But more often it's like in Aladdin. Jasmine's mother ends up dead, but it doesn't seem to affect anything about her in the entire movie. It took until Aladdin 3 before Aladdin decided to carry out all about his parents. The death of a parent is something that always affects you, even if it happened when you were young. I don't know why animated films and even television shows keep doing this. You know, besides a cruel, sadistic tradition. Maybe they've gotten the perception that all animation parents are awful, and the only way to give the child character a remotely happy life is to kill them off. A lot of it is laziness. I get that a lot of it comes from the movie not strictly being about the loss of a parent, but it's not hard to add a bit of detail. A line here or there, something to suggest that this character knew that their parent existed at one point in time, or that their living parent actually, you know, cares about their kid. Once again, I've ranted on this in a recent review, so I don't want to go too far into it. But to give you an overview, I'm sick and tired of cartoons and animated movies breaking stereotypes in the laziest way possible, usually just for marketing or social brownie points. True to form, not only animation has been doing this as of late, but animation is specifically good at exaggerating, and when most try to tell morals using animation or one of these characters I'm going to mention, they tend to end up forgetting the nuance that's an absolute necessity if you want to tackle this kind of subject matter. You've probably heard of one of these characters before, I'm sure.
Can the young woman break the glass ceiling and prove once and for all that a female can be just as good an athlete as a male?
You know, Amy, anytime someone calls attention to the breaking of gender rules, it ultimately undermines the concept of gender equality by implying that this is an exception and not the status quo.
Fucking genius!
They added a female character because they didn't want to be accused of being sexist for not having a female character, and that's the only reason that they added this female character. But they don't know what to do with her, so they make her loud and obnoxious about being a girl. And she doesn't need no one, and how she could beat up all of the boys. She's not like those other girls. This girl is different than the other girls. She doesn't fall into stereotypes. She's a tomboy and she loves sports. You know, like every other fucking tomboy stereotype in media history. It's funny how only male characters are allowed to be masculine and actually hate sports. Apparently female characters can't do that. But I mean, if you only want to put in a token effort, you do you, I guess. These kind of characters are not breaking stereotypes, they're just trading old stereotypes for new ones. Then you have characters like the Powerpuff Girls in the reboot. Marketing tells us that they're an inspiration and what girls should aspire towards. It ends up getting kinda awkward when they repeatedly get captured and beaten and aren't allowed to fight like the boys and hold their own, because this show has some of the laziest social inspiration messages that I've ever come across. Do I really even need to talk about Miss Keena Miss Bellum again? Well, too bad, I'm gonna. Miss Bellum is a bad female stereotype, so we gotta get rid of her because she's a bad inspiration for girls. In the same episode, we're gonna introduce a couple more female stereotypes, the fashion villains, because apparently that's a good stereotype. And then, of course, there's moments like this.
I don't act like other dragons?
Oh, not even close.
But why would you want to, Spike?
Yeah, Spike, you're not like those other boys, I mean dragons. You're not a brutish, loud, bullying asshole. You should be more like the girls, I mean ponies. They're nice. You know, ignoring the bullying you for your feminine behavior. And they're even actually allowed to have varied personalities. Haven't you noticed? You could just take a bunch of female characters, make them males, and that will make them total jackasses. In Lisa the Simpson, the conflict is that Lisa might have a gene that makes her stupid as she grows up. But in the end of the episode, she learns that it only affects the males of her family, and thus the problem is solved. Even though it is showcased that Bart will be having to deal with this problem for his entire life. I did a whole review on Peter Asment that tried to break the stereotype of men can't be sexually harassed, but ended up saying that it was okay for a woman to rape a man if she was lonely. Like, it wasn't trying to be funny, it was a legitimate issue in the story. Once again, you're not breaking stereotypes, you're just trading old ones for new ones, and I absolutely hate this. What these shows think is progressive ends up basically walking us in an entire circle. This is so high on the list because it usually breaks the overall point of what you're trying to convey. This is what they're trying to accomplish, escaping stereotypes. And by running into any of these tropes, They fall right smack dab into them, right on their face. How good is representation of any minority if that person ends up being a stereotypical portrayal of that minority? That's the most common way for this thing to happen. It's why Brian's cousin Jasper was so viciously hated. And yes, I know that this is a problem that many media have, but like I said, animation is particularly good at exaggeration, so the problem is much worse here. On the other hand, you have the perfect minority representation, as showcased in episodes like Boys vs. Girls as Teen Titans Go, and Love Struck. While both of these are comedies, more dramatic stories tend to go on in a similar way. They end up creating an ideal that ends up being impossible for any reasonable human being to live up to, and once again, creates new stereotypes, new conflicts, and it doesn't end up helping the matters of representation in the slightest. Once again, because everything is far too one note. The girl is strong enough to beat up the boys, which she frequently does on screen. That's a perfect message that you want to teach anyone. You know, she's just a character. It's not like anyone's going to imitate her, even though this character exists for the sole reason to be imitated. And this works out especially well because this is the most common type of female character to build, specifically to be a role model for girls. Oh yeah, Jailbreak, I'm coming for you. You're not gonna hack your way out of this. In 1992, the world was taken away with Robin Williams' portrayal of the genie in the movie Aladdin. He was a fast-talking pop culture reference and delight. The performance was amazing, and it was funny. He was the true essence of comic relief, and he changed cinema forever. Now, every animated movie ever needs a comic relief character, even if it doesn't belong in the movie. It's strange because people go on and on about how much they hate stupid comic relief characters, and yet these stupid comic relief characters keep coming on in every single movie. Every time you ask, they end up being people's least favorite part of the movie. The chicken from Moana, the minions from Despicable Me, the gargoyles from Hunchback, High Five from the Emoji Movie, Mater from Cars. Each time that they've been the worst part of the movie, I have a feeling that they end up in the movie at all is because the producers thought that it's a kids animated film, and kids animated films need to have a stupid comic relief character. You know, except Coraline, or Zootopia, or Inside Out, or Wreck-It Ralph, or Ratatouille, or many other examples that have gotten to a level higher than the Minions could ever get. These movies work so well because they understood that you can't have all comedy in a movie coming from one place, or they will inevitably become annoying. And maybe, just maybe, if the characters are going so against the tone of a film like with, say, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, maybe it would be a bad idea to include these comic relief characters. I hate this cliche so much because of what it represents. The worst of this example comes from people who treat animation as a genre, not a medium. It's a kid's comedy, and so we need laughs within it. And we need to sand off our edge, because that's what you have to do with animated films. Or, of course, even worse, they're just throwing these characters in because they're mimetic and marketable. The forced comic relief is always the sidekick or best friend, and that's also becoming obnoxious. Hades was the best part of Hercules because he got to be both the comic relief and the villain, and he played both of them fantastic. The movie wouldn't have been as good if they were separate entities. And most of these movies that shoehorn in a comic relief, they don't seem to know how to write comedy well. Especially because, well, many of these movies shouldn't have even attempted comedy. Hunchback of Notre Dame is the clearest, most famous example. It's not a comedy. The gargoyles don't belong there. It frequently damages the tone. And keep in mind, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is my favorite Disney film of all time, in spite of the gargoyles, not because of them. Then you have the chicken from Moana, which was just pointless comic relief for having the sake of pointless comic relief. Because every movie needs to have a comic relief, except you're Disney and you're supposed to be better than this. This is why people were so apprehensive of Frozen when they unveiled Olaf before the movie even came out. Because even back in 2012, people knew the comic relief characters that didn't need to be in the goddamn movie were the worst. Luckily, Olaf managed to be one of the more tolerable examples, although he still has his moments. And of course, the poison of the trend makes me more apprehensive to any future attempts. Also, you can't mention forced comic relief characters without talking about the Minions. The Minions are proof that this trope is only going to get worse and more stale as time goes on. Other things get ripped off too, like South Park's shock humor or Ren and Stimpy's Gross Out, or Shrek. The difference is that the Minions not only have never had any good influence on animation, but I'm fairly sure that they will never have a good influence on animation. You can make shock humor work. You can't make Minions ripoffs work. It's always the same shtick. The only thing you can really say about them, the only positive benefit that they've had, is that they've kept Illumination pictures alive. With movies like Sing, The Lorax, and The Minions movie, that's debatable. Seriously, I watched the Minions movie recently and it is the most tedious fucking thing ever. But that's a story for another day.
there I was came saying.
Animation villains are great, aren't they? Actually, I think that's a bit of a misstatement. Animation villains, especially Disney villains, have been great in the past. We've had characters like Frollo, Jafar, Ursula, Gaston, all memorable for all the right reasons.
Oh, Anna. If only there was someone out there who loved you.
In the modern era, we've got characters like Hans and Bellwether, both characters that are the worst parts of their respective movie. This is because Disney has become obsessed with the twist villain, and it seems like other studios are starting to pick it up. Hello, Smiler. And this bugs the hell out of me. Do you want to know why Disney villains of the past are so memorable and why the modern ones, well, aren't? It's because we got to spend the whole movie with them. We learn about them and their hopes and desires like we should for any character. It's not reserved for just the good guys, the heroes. Villains require depth too. They're not just forces of nature. This is why Hades is significantly more memorable than the Titans. Sure, the Titans are more destructive, but Hades is the one with the charisma and the personality. We know about him and what he wants and what he's willing to go through to get it. And we've known that from the beginning. On the other end of the spectrum, we get Assistant Mayor Bellwether, one of my least favorite Disney villains of all time, especially when you compare her to someone like Frollo, one of my favorite villains of all time. This is especially striking when you consider the similarities. Both of them want to oppress a specific class of people, both of them appear respectable to the public, both of them end up manipulating the hero of the movie instead of evil ends. However, even though Bellwether ends up more successful in her aims, she is a lot less memorable in the end. Why? Because we only got to know Bellwether the villain in the last 5 minutes of the movie, and anything else that we learned and knew about her, well, it was a lie. I think that the intent was to make her seem more cunning, but in the end it seems like lazy writing for the same reason that any bad twist feels like lazy writing. First of all, taking Zootopia aside, this is the 4th time that Disney had done this. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the 4th time that they had done it in a row. And that's if you discount the Pixar films, Toy Story 3, Up, and Cars 2. It wasn't a surprise, and I was fully expecting them to have a twist villain. The very second that Bellwether ended up on screen, I knew that she was the villain because she was the perfect candidate to be the twist villain. When the twist villain is done poorly, it's either absurdly obvious like in the Emoji Movie or in Cars 2, or it feels like something added in the last drafts, like with Hands in Frozen. I keep saying this, but I feel it's important to note that I do like many of these movies. The Emoji Movie and Cars 2 are the only ones that I don't like, but sooner or later, a movie that uses these tropes will win my ire, even if the movie is otherwise technically fine. I had a hard time liking Moana because it did use a lot of tropes and cliches that I've gotten just absurdly tired with over the years. When it comes to twist villains, at its worst, like with so many Disney movies of the 2010s, it feels like the movie made their villain a twist villain so they could actually get out of spending time and efforts, well, writing a villain. After all, if you couldn't pick up on the signs that weren't there, it just means that they were too clever for you, right? After all, Hans turning is supposed to be jarring. It's not a last-minute change to add some tension because the movie was running short. Bellwether turning was supposed to come out of nowhere. She was clever enough to hide the clues. Were you clever enough to find them? Honestly, Bellwether was just so predictable and so forced in, which you'd think were opposing concepts, but Bellwether taught me no, they're not. You could be absurdly predictable and absurdly forced at the same time. Think about this, Moana was the first Disney animated film in half a decade to not have a twist villain. That's a long time. It's not clever. It was clever in Wreck-It Ralph, the one that really kicked off this trend, but that's because we got to know King Candy as a villain halfway through, not at the very end of the film, and he was a consistent character all the way through. Hans at the beginning and the end of the movie are two separate characters. And honestly, Wreck-It Ralph and King Candy is getting to be kind of a South Park kind of deal, where I hate that it was done so well because now it seems like Disney won't stop fucking doing it. Then again, they've been doing this since Atlantis. No, I'm sorry, they've been doing this since Tarzan. Those villains are so practically identical that they run together in my head. The only reason Bellwether doesn't join them is because she's a sheep. That's not a joke. I'm being actually serious. I find that it's borderline impossible to have both a twist villain and an interesting villain. They seem antithetical to each other. I don't care if it was the innocent guy in the back, the hero's love interest, the best friend, or even the hero themselves. They've all been done, and especially recently. And I'm probably going to pick up on anything you throw me. The best example I can think of is Jack Silver from Treasure Planet. He's technically a twist villain, but only technically. It's pretty obvious to the audience that he's a bad guy. And so, it adds a very interesting character dynamic that makes him a stronger character. Dramatic irony is quite useful. We get to know Jack Silver's debate, wanting the treasure, but also wanting to take care of and not use this kid he's forced to watch. Compare him to Hans. Great, everything that I knew about him was a lie, and I need to start over where he's basically just a generic evil guy with a plan. That makes him so memorable.
There I was, came saying.
And now, because I only had 11 numbers, and there are literally thousands of potential candidates, here's some honorable mentions. All animated movies must be 3D, unless they're based on a TV show. I guess we all have our cliches. I didn't mention this one on the list because it rarely affects my overall enjoyment of the actual movies, but yeah, I do miss 2D animation not based on a television show, especially because the decision to make a movie 3D seems to be largely arbitrary. You can make a movie like Frozen or Tangled in 2D easily without changing anything. All stop-motion movies must be creepy or horror. I get that stop-motion can be uncanny and move in a creepy way, but that doesn't mean that every single stop-motion film ever should try to be the next Nightmare Before Christmas or Coraline. I'd also like to see that tackle more genres as well. Twins acting exactly the same, or cartoon episodes taking on the clones plot. It's amazing how often you get these tropes. You see, it allows them to save a lot of work because they can use the same character design once, twice, or even more without any extra work. And it's even worse when the twins act exactly the same. Pretend you have integrity and write different characters once in a while. Songs interrupted by dialogue. You know what I love listening to when looking up my favorite animated movie songs on YouTube? That minute-long stretch of dialogue that breaks up the flow because no one bothered to cut it out. The Two Douchebags cartoon. Your fanboy and chum-chums, your Sanjays and Craigs, your breadwinners. I left this one off the list because it seems to be mostly dying, but it's still annoying going back to watch those late 2000s shows. Memes. Memes in animation are stupid. The time that it takes to animate something means that the meme is going to be irrelevant and out of date by the time the animation goes to air. It's always tacky. Gross out and shock humor. I've already talked about this one enough, so I thought that I'd keep it off the list. I still don't get it. The emotion of disgust isn't appealing in any way. It's literally programmed to do the opposite of being appealing. Movies about what your whatever does when you're not looking. Toys, cars, emotions, emojis, sausages, tampons, doesn't matter. If you're making an animated movie about this concept, you're fighting an uphill battle to make your movie interesting, because it is so beaten into the ground. It wasn't even original when Toy Story did it. It's certainly not original and it's been done by every mainstream animated film since. Adding in useless characters. Dill from Rugrats, Sparky from Fairly Odd Parents, Bliss from Powerpuff 2016. This desperate attempt to save ratings largely seems like it's the death knell of any show. Refusing to age up your characters. This has been touted as one of the benefits of animation, but when you get down to it, it seems to be more of a hindrance at best and a crutch at worst, as shows become a zombie of themselves like with The Simpsons or with Fairly Odd Parents. I get the want to keep your kid characters at the same age for all time, but the way I see it is that most cartoons that get to the point where aging up their characters would be a problem have gotten stale, rote, and routine, and having their child characters actually grow up and go through new milestones in their life would actually do something to keep their shows special, refreshing, and interesting. DreamWorks face. Basically, because Shrek had this face in advertising, all animation films ever need to have this exact same expression. Also, we should probably throw in every single animated trailer being exactly the same. And I guess we should also throw in Shrek. Just everything about Shrek. Shrek had like a monstrous bad influence on animated movies, like just the worst. Many things on this list come specifically because of Shrek. And it seems like all of the horrible trends nowadays came because of that movie. And finally, keeping the same voice in a body swap episode. You're lazy and you have no faith in your audience's intelligence. And now, without further ado,
it's time for the moment you've been waiting for. Duh.
Anna, no, please.
I'm not even gonna try to be hesitant or funny or whatever when I say that the worst trope in animation is the fake-out death. I don't think that I have to describe this one in any detail. It's that moment where whoever is not really dead because of fairy dust, a wish, tears, a literal reset button, or for no fucking reason at all. Silly heroes, death only exists for bad people. Any movie that tries to pull this stunt off should quite frankly be ashamed of itself. There is no reason to even try and attempt this anymore. Not even for comedy, because it's long past the point of being funny. Yeah, I get it, no one really dies in cinema. But when a character comes back to life a minute later, I think it's a bit of an extreme interpretation. What makes the concept of death so intimidating is that it's permanent. It only creates tension because it's something that you can't come back from. This is what makes it more devastating than, say, going to the bathroom, even though both can be insanely painful. If a character can just come back from being removed at the end of the movie, then they could have come back at any time if they were destroyed at any other point. This means that all of the stakes and all of the tension evaporate instantly. And it becomes insulting, like you took something that didn't belong to you. Let's talk about why movies do this. You know, beyond the animated movies have always done this, because yeah, this is probably the oldest trope on the list. After all, we've been seeing this since Snow White when it comes to animated films. The Disney death, as it's called, is used because producers of the film think so little of their target audience that they can't handle something that we will all have to deal with. And so they sugarcoat the idea so it becomes harder for the child to actually learn about the concept of death, and thus harder to deal with when it actually comes around in their everyday actual life. This is number one on the list, not because of how prevalent or how cheap or lazy it is. It is number one on the list because I think they're going to do actual harm. I don't mean that it's going to screw people up, but the constant messages that death is impermanent, it would make it a lot harder for a child to deal with the idea of death when they're eventually forced to deal with it. It would not make it easier. Talking about death, unfortunately, is something where you have to rip the bandage off. Not this middling nothing. I get it. Death is a difficult idea to deal with. Even as a grown adult, I have difficulty with all of its implications myself, but at no point would I ever want to be lied to about it in that it's a thing that doesn't exist. If a child had someone in their life that was dying, watching these movies back to back would confuse them at best, or give them a false hope at worst, that someone might finally cure that terminally ill family member at the last moment, or actually revive the dead. If they have had someone die, especially recently, this trope might piss them off, or give them complicated emotions that they do not need. And if they've never had someone die, this is a terrible introduction to the concept, and it's going to make it much harder to realistically explain death to them when the time comes. And as much as we hate to think about it, this is something that's going to come up one way or another. A character dying is a point of movies like Bambi and The Lion King. And anyone who would want to say that this kind of trash trope can make a film better, or easier to deal with, would you argue that either of those films would be better if Bambi's mom or Mufasa came back to life at some point? You're not sparing the emotions of a child by doing this. You're just holding off the inevitable, and making it a lot harsher when the inevitable comes crashing down. This is the most blatant and brazen form of talking down to a child that I can think of, and not taking them seriously. Yes, death could be a difficult topic to deal with, but it is one thing that is universal to the entire human experience, and it has to be done with due respect. And yeah, if a character that a kid really likes ends up dying in the film, a kid is probably going to cry. If you do the death right, and the character is moving, an adult is supposed to cry too. It's called drama. And if you're bringing death into the situation, getting your audience cry is usually what you're supposed to be doing. But no, back out with your fucking cowardice. This has been in so many movies that it has gotten to the point of mockery, where people are making parodies and jokes about it, even though it's still happening and taken seriously by movies. But even as a parody, you can't find it funny because it's been done so much. It's incredibly obvious and it's incredibly stupid. And half of the time, it feels arbitrary or forced. Speaking of arbitrary and forced, and join us next time when we review a movie that has many of the cliches on this list, and many, many more.
Don't be scared, you got the moves prepared. Go on and kiss the girl. la 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 la. Don't stop now, don't try to hide it. How you wanna kiss it, girl?
There I was, came, saying.